She betrayed him, or so he thought, until 2 years later, the Millionaire CEO saw the twins who had his eyes. Kevin Wilson had spent most of his life mastering the art of control. Control over his company, control over his reputation, control over every aspect of his existence. Nothing about him was accidental. Every suit he wore, every meeting he led, every decision he made was part of a carefully constructed image of perfection. People admired him, envied him, feared him, but no one ever really knew him. That was the way he liked it. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness had no place in his world. But everything he thought he understood about power and control began to crumble the day Emily Brown walked into his office. She wasn't like the others, those sleek, polished women who saw him as an opportunity rather than a man. Emily was quiet but sharp, graceful without realizing it, and her smile carried a warmth that disarmed him in ways he didn't understand. She started as his assistant, and at first, he tried to keep their relationship strictly professional. But late nights in the office blurred the lines. Her laughter became the sound he waited for, her voice the calm in the storm of his demanding world. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was temporary, that he could keep it under control like everything else. He was wrong. For a while, they were happy in their own small way. She never asked for more than he could give, and he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could balance love and ambition. But deep down, fear always lingered, a quiet, poisonous whisper reminding him that attachments made men weak, that emotions made them reckless. When Emily told him she loved him, he froze. He didn't say it back, though a part of him wanted to. Instead, he nodded stiffly, pretending not to see the disappointment flicker across her face. He told himself that love wasn't necessary, that what they had was enough. The illusion shattered one quiet afternoon when Emily knocked on his office door, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small white object. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Kevin, I need to tell you something." He looked up from his computer, impatient, already irritated by the interruption. But the words that followed struck him harder than any business loss ever could. "I'm pregnant." For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing. The air between them thickened until it felt impossible to breathe. She looked terrified but also hopeful, like she was waiting for him to take her in his arms and tell her it would be okay. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What did you just say?" His tone was sharp, almost disbelieving. Emily swallowed hard. "I'm pregnant, Kevin." It wasn't planned, but, before she could finish, he slammed his hand on the desk. "You planned this on purpose, didn't you?" The accusation came out like venom. She flinched, staring at him with wide, wounded eyes. "No, I didn't. How can you even think that?" He paced the room, his mind spiraling, anger masking the panic rising in his chest. "Do you have any idea what this will do to me? To my company? To everything I've built?" His words echoed in the silence, cruel and detached, and when he finally looked at her, the hope in her expression had vanished. "I thought you'd be happy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought you loved me." For a second, something inside him wavered, but pride smothered it before it could grow. "This was a mistake," he said coldly. "All of it." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt something shift in the room, as if the air itself recoiled from him. Emily stared at him for a moment longer, tears slipping down her cheeks, then turned and walked out. The sound of the door closing was final, sharp, and unbearably quiet. Kevin stood there for a long time, his heart pounding. He told himself he had done the right thing, that this was necessary, that he couldn't let emotions derail him. He was supposed to feel relief, but all he felt was a hollow ache spreading through his chest. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey tasted like guilt. He tried to go back to work, but every line of the document in front of him blurred until it was meaningless. When night fell, he sat in his office alone, staring at the city lights beyond the glass, haunted by the memory of her face as she walked away. The next morning, she didn't come in. Her desk was empty, her phone disconnected. Within days, she was gone from his life completely. He tried to convince himself he didn't care, that it was better this way. But at night, when he closed his eyes, he saw her again, her trembling hands, her tear-filled eyes, her quiet voice saying, "I thought you loved me." He tried to bury the memory under work, under power, under the noise of success, but it clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. He told himself he had chosen logic over emotion, strength over weakness. But deep down, something in him knew the truth. He hadn't chosen strength at all, he had chosen fear. And one day, that fear would come back for him, in a way he could never have imagined. 2 days after Emily left, Kevin came to the office earlier than usual, as if starting the day before anyone else could somehow drown out the silence she had left behind. But even the steady rhythm of his routines couldn't erase her presence. Her desk sat empty, her nameplate still in place, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a memory that refused to fade. When his new assistant arrived a week later, a polished woman with perfect diction and a colder smile, he didn't bother learning much about her. She could type faster, manage meetings efficiently, but her presence only reminded him of what was missing. He told himself this was how things were supposed to be, neat, controlled, professional, but the truth was that every perfectly ordered moment felt hollow. He buried himself in work with the kind of obsession that only guilt could fuel. His company grew even faster in the months that followed, profits soared, awards came in, and investors called him a visionary. But success felt sterile. The more he achieved, the less it mattered. At night, he returned to his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, poured himself a drink, and sat in silence. There were no calls from anyone who cared, no laughter, no warmth. Only the hum of the city below and the echo of words he couldn't forget. "You planned this on purpose." He could still see the way her eyes dimmed when he said it, the way her shoulders trembled before she turned away. He'd replay that moment over and over, convincing himself he'd had no choice, that she had wanted something from him he couldn't give. But even lies, repeated often enough, began to lose their power. Months turned into a year, and the guilt didn't fade, it calcified, turning into something heavy that sat in his chest. He dated occasionally, more out of habit than desire. Beautiful women in elegant dresses, the kind who fit perfectly into photographs but never into his life. Conversations felt rehearsed, laughter forced. None of them had Emily's quiet honesty, the way she had looked at him like she saw through all his armor and still didn't flinch. It was easier to pretend she never existed, but the smallest things betrayed him. A song she used to hum when she worked. The smell of coffee in the morning. A strand of blonde hair caught on one of his old shirts. Each reminder hit like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. One night, after a charity event filled with handshakes and champagne smiles, he came home to find a letter waiting on his desk. It wasn't from Emily, she had disappeared too completely for that, but something about it stopped him. It was from a lawyer, notifying him that Emily had resigned from the company officially, forfeiting all benefits and signing away any claim to future compensation. There was no message, no note, just her signature at the bottom of the page, precise, graceful, final. He stared at it for a long time, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. For the first time in years, he realized what it meant to be truly alone. The following months dragged on in a blur of monotony. He traveled often, chasing projects across cities, anything to keep moving so he wouldn't have to think. But there were moments, quiet, unexpected ones, when he'd look out the window of a plane and imagine a small hand reaching for his, or hear a child's laugh and feel a sharp ache in his chest. He tried to ignore it, but it only grew stronger. He didn't know where Emily had gone or what she had done with her life. He told himself he didn't care. But when he closed his eyes, he couldn't stop wondering. Was she happy? Had she moved on? Had she kept the baby? The thought haunted him. At first, he refused to believe she would. She was practical, grounded, she would have made the rational choice. But then he remembered the way her hand had rested protectively on her stomach that day, even as he accused her of lying. That small, unconscious gesture, filled with instinct and love. And suddenly, the certainty he'd clung to started to crumble. What if she hadn't gone alone? What if somewhere out there was a child, his child, growing up without ever knowing his name? That night, for the first time in years, Kevin didn't sleep. He sat in his office, the city lights flickering through the glass, and thought about what kind of man he had become. He'd built everything he thought he wanted, yet none of it could fill the emptiness he had created with his own words. The power, the money, the influence, none of it meant anything when he couldn't even face the one person who had once loved him without asking for anything in return. A year later, his company announced a massive coastal expansion project, and he volunteered to oversee it personally. Everyone was surprised. Kevin Wilson didn't usually handle field work anymore, but he told them he needed a change of scenery. In truth, he needed distance from the ghosts of his own making. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he couldn't stay in the same city where every street reminded him of her. The small coastal town was everything his world wasn't: quiet, slow, unpretentious. The people there smiled for no reason, the air smelled like salt and fresh bread, and for the first time in a long time, Kevin felt something close to peace. He rented a small house by the water, told himself it was temporary, just a place to focus on the project. But the sound of the waves at night made him think of her again, of the softness in her voice, the warmth of her hands, the things he'd thrown away without hesitation. He didn't know it yet, but fate had already begun to turn. Somewhere in that same town, a woman he once called a mistake was tucking two small girls into bed, their laughter echoing through the house. They had his eyes, his quiet determination, his stubborn spirit. And while Kevin Wilson sat alone by the sea, trying to forget, his entire future was only a few streets away, 2 years old, giggling, and calling someone else a mommy. Emily had never imagined that starting over could feel both terrifying and liberating at the same time. When she left the city behind, she wasn't just running from Kevin, she was running from the version of herself that had believed she could change a man who only trusted power. The first few months were the hardest. She had nowhere to go, no one to call, and the life growing inside her demanded strength she didn't think she had. The money she had saved barely lasted through the pregnancy, and the isolation nearly broke her. But when the twins were born, the world shifted. In that quiet hospital room, under the soft glow of a single light, she looked down at two tiny faces, identical, perfect, and full of life, and knew she had to live differently now. She named them Lily and Rose, names that carried gentleness but also resilience, because she wanted them to grow up with both. Those early days were sleepless, chaotic, and exhausting, but Emily never complained. Every cry, every late-night feeding reminded her that she had done the right thing, even if it meant losing everything she thought she needed. The girls grew fast, filling her days with joy she hadn't known existed. Lily was curious, always asking questions with eyes full of wonder, while Rose was quieter, observant, often watching her mother with the same steady gaze that reminded Emily painfully of Kevin. Sometimes, when the twins laughed together, she would catch her breath. It was the same kind of deep, wholehearted laughter he used to have before the world made him hard. And even though she had promised herself never to think about him again, she couldn't stop. He was there in small ways, in the slope of the girls' noses, in the shape of their smiles, in the occasional flash of brown in their eyes when the sunlight hit just right. She had found work in a local bakery shortly after moving into a small rented house near the coast. The job didn't pay much, but it was enough to keep them afloat. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Turner, had taken an immediate liking to Emily. "You've got hands that know patience," she once said, watching Emily knead dough. "People who've been hurt make the best bread. They understand what it means to rise again." Emily smiled softly at that, not realizing how true those words would become. Life settled into a rhythm that was simple but full. She would wake early to prepare breakfast for the girls, walk them to the small daycare down the street, then head to the bakery. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon greeted her every morning, and though her hands were often tired, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. In the evenings, she would pick up the twins, take them to the park by the sea, and watch them chase the waves. The ocean became her confidant, its endless movement mirroring the way her past ebbed and flowed inside her. Sometimes, when the girls asked about their father, Emily's voice faltered. "He's far away," she would say gently. "But he loves you, in his own way." It was a lie she told to protect them, and maybe to protect herself. She didn't want them to grow up thinking they were unwanted. Deep down, she still believed that somewhere inside Kevin was the man she had once glimpsed, the one who could love fiercely if only he allowed himself to. But that man was gone, buried under ambition and pride, and she refused to waste her life waiting for him to reappear. The town slowly became her refuge. The people there didn't pry. They accepted her as she was, a young mother doing her best. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the window after the girls had fallen asleep, watching the rain slide down the glass. Those were the moments when her thoughts wandered back to the city, to the office, to that final day. She could still hear his voice, cold and full of accusation, could still see the disbelief in his eyes when she told him the truth. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted the words he'd said. Then she'd shake her head, push the thought away, and remind herself that regret didn't build futures, it only chained people to their past. As the twins approached their second birthday, Emily felt a shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning to live. She started sketching again, something she hadn't done since before her life with Kevin. She would draw the sea, the sky, the faces of her daughters as they slept. The drawings filled the walls of their small home, turning it into something bright and warm. Mrs. Turner noticed her talent and encouraged her to enter a local art fair. "You've got more inside you than pain," she said. "Show them that." Emily hesitated, but the twins' excitement pushed her forward. When they saw her paintings displayed at the fair, they clapped their little hands and said, "Mommy made the pretty pictures." For the first time, Emily felt proud not just of surviving, but of becoming someone new. Yet beneath that newfound peace, something restless stirred. Every now and then, she'd wake from dreams she couldn't fully remember, dreams where she was standing on a familiar street, hearing a voice call her name, turning just in time to see a man with brown hair and eyes that once burned with everything she had loved and feared. She would wake with her heart pounding and tell herself it was nothing, just memories trying to claw their way back. But deep down, she sensed that the past wasn't done with her yet. She didn't know that miles away, in a city full of glass and steel, that same man sometimes woke from dreams of a woman walking away from him, her hair glinting gold in the light. He would sit up, his chest tight, not understanding why the ache in him never faded no matter how many years passed. Emily thought she had built a life safe from the ghosts of her past, but fate had already begun to draw the circle closed. And when it did, it wouldn't ask for her permission, it would simply bring everything she had buried right back to her doorstep. Kevin didn't recognize the man he had become. 2 years had passed since Emily walked out of his life, but the distance between who he was then and who he was now felt immeasurable. The sharpness that once defined him had dulled, replaced by a quiet unease he couldn't shake. He still ran his empire with precision, still commanded boardrooms with authority, but behind every decision was a hollow kind of motion, like a machine that kept running long after the purpose was gone. His reflection in the mirror each morning looked the same: tailored suit, steady eyes, a man in control, but he could feel the cracks forming underneath the surface. He had everything and yet felt as though he'd lost everything that mattered. It started with small things. He'd catch himself watching families in parks on his way to work, parents lifting their laughing children, the sound of joy echoing in the air, and he'd feel something twist painfully in his chest. At first, he dismissed it as sentimentality, something that came with age, but the feeling persisted. Then, one afternoon, he saw a little girl in the lobby of his office building, curly brown hair, big brown eyes, and for a second, his breath caught. She looked up at him and smiled, and he almost smiled back before realizing she wasn't his. That night, he went home and drank more than usual, the memory of that child's face haunting him long after he closed his eyes. It was during a corporate retreat that fate began to weave its threads again. His company had acquired property on the coast, and he had to personally oversee the renovation of a luxury hotel project. He didn't want to go, the idea of being away from the city made him restless. But his partners insisted, and part of him knew he needed the distance. He told himself it was just another project, another chance to prove he still had the drive that had built his success. What he didn't expect was how peaceful the coastal town would feel. There was something disarming about its simplicity, the way the ocean air cut through the noise in his head, the way the locals treated him like a person instead of a CEO. He felt anonymous for the first time in years, and the anonymity was strange but comforting. He spent his days in meetings with contractors and architects and his evenings walking along the shore, where the horizon seemed endless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the waves, he stopped by a small cafe near the hotel site. It wasn't part of any chain, just a cozy place with handwritten menus and the smell of fresh pastries. The moment he walked in, he felt something shift, an unexplainable pull, a familiarity that made his heartbeat quicken for reasons he didn't understand. There were only a few customers, and behind the counter stood a woman with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes. She greeted him warmly and handed him a menu, but he barely noticed her words. His attention had drifted to the corner of the cafe, where a soft sound of laughter caught his ear. Two little girls sat at a small table near the window, their chairs too big for their small frames. They were coloring on paper placemats, their heads bent close together. They were identical, same brown hair, same wide brown eyes, same tiny gap between their front teeth when they smiled. Something about them tugged at him, a strange familiarity he couldn't name. He watched them for a few seconds longer than he should have, and when one of them looked up, their eyes met. She blinked curiously, then grinned before turning back to her sister. He smiled faintly, unsure why the sight unsettled him so much. It wasn't until he stepped back outside, the cool air brushing his face, that the unease hit him fully. Those eyes, that smile, it was as if he had seen them before, not in reality but in dreams that refused to fade. The following days, he found excuses to pass by the cafe again. Sometimes, he would sit outside with a coffee, pretending to check emails while secretly glancing toward the window. The twins were often there, drawing, giggling, their presence lighting up the space around them. One afternoon, he saw the cafe door open and watched as a woman walked out carrying a small box of pastries. She was wearing a pale blue dress, her blonde hair tied back in a simple knot, and though he couldn't see her face clearly at first, something inside him froze. When she turned toward the street, sunlight caught her hair, and the breath left his lungs. Emily. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. It had been 2 years since he'd seen her, but time hadn't erased her. If anything, she looked stronger, more radiant, though there was a softness to her that came from the kind of peace he had never been able to give her. His gaze dropped to the 2 girls who ran to her, clinging to her legs, their laughter carrying through the air. She bent down to kiss their heads, her eyes full of tenderness. It hit him then, so suddenly it made him stumble back. The girls. They weren't just any children. They were his. He didn't need proof, didn't need tests, he saw himself in their faces, in the shape of their smiles, in the way one of them scrunched her nose the exact same way he did when thinking. His heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. For a few seconds, he just stood there, hidden behind the corner of the building, watching as Emily lifted one of the girls into her arms and laughed at something the other said. The sight was almost too much to bear. She looked happy, free, untouched by the pain he had left her with. And yet, beneath the happiness, he saw traces of exhaustion, shadows under her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders. She had survived without him, but at what cost? Kevin spent the rest of that evening pacing his room, replaying the scene in his mind over and over. He couldn't make sense of the storm inside him, guilt, wonder, disbelief, a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to see them again, but he didn't know how. What right did he have to walk back into their lives after what he'd done? And yet, the idea of walking away now felt unbearable. He had spent years building empires, chasing numbers and titles, but seeing those girls had made everything else meaningless. He didn't know how to fix what he'd broken, but for the first time, he wanted to try. That night, sleep refused to come. He stood by the window, watching the ocean crash against the shore, and whispered her name into the silence. Emily. He didn't know if she would forgive him, if she even could, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't leave this town, not yet. Because somewhere beneath the pain and the pride, something had started to awaken inside him again. Something that had been buried since the day she walked out of his office. And this time, he wouldn't let fear dictate his choices. The next morning, Kevin woke before dawn, unable to quiet the turmoil in his chest. He had barely slept, his mind haunted by the image of Emily laughing with the 2 little girls who bore his eyes. Every time he closed his own, he saw her holding them, saw the way they clung to her like she was their whole world, and a sharp ache ran through him. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window of the small rental house, staring out at the horizon as the first light began to spill over the ocean. The sound of waves breaking against the rocks outside was usually calming, but today it only mirrored the relentless pounding of his thoughts. He knew what he wanted, to see her again, to speak to her, but he didn't know if he had the right. After everything he'd said, everything he'd done, what could he possibly say now that would matter? He told himself he just needed closure, some kind of confirmation that she and the children were happy, that she didn't need anything from him. Maybe then he could move on. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. He didn't want closure, he wanted redemption, even if he didn't deserve it. As the morning sun climbed higher, he made a decision. He would go to the cafe again, just to see her. Maybe he wouldn't talk to her, maybe he would just watch, but he had to know if what he'd seen yesterday was real or some cruel trick of fate. By the time he arrived, the cafe was busier than before. He stood across the street for a few moments, watching through the window. Emily was inside, wearing a soft cream sweater and a messy bun, her hair falling loose around her face. The girls were sitting at the same corner table, their little feet swinging under the chairs. One of them was scribbling something on a napkin, while the other was talking animatedly, waving her arms. Emily leaned down to listen, smiling gently, her hand brushing one girl's cheek. Kevin's throat tightened. He had seen her smile before, but never like that. There was something purer in it, something untouched by the weight of ambition and pain that had marked their past. He almost turned away, afraid to ruin what he was seeing. But then one of the girls pointed toward the window and whispered something to her sister. Both turned their heads, and for a brief, terrifying moment, their eyes met his. They blinked in unison, their brown eyes curious but unafraid, and then one of them, he thought it was the one who had smiled at him yesterday, waved. The gesture was small and innocent, but it felt like an arrow piercing straight through his chest. Before he could react, Emily turned around to see what had caught their attention. Her gaze landed on him, and the world seemed to stop. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The noise of the cafe faded, the sound of traffic outside dissolved, and it was just them, two people who had once shared everything and then destroyed it all with a single argument. Her expression shifted from surprise to disbelief to something else entirely, something he couldn't name. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her lips parted as if to say something but no words came. Then she turned away abruptly, picking up one of the girls and whispering something to her before heading toward the back of the cafe. Kevin stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hands clenched at his sides. He waited, unsure what to do, but she didn't come back out. After several long minutes, he finally stepped inside, his pulse hammering. The older woman at the counter, Mrs. Turner, he remembered now from the sign, looked up at him with polite curiosity. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" He hesitated, his voice unsteady when he finally spoke. "The woman who was just here, Emily, does she work here?" The woman's smile softened in a way that made him feel exposed. "Yes," she said. "She helps out most mornings. But if you're looking for her, I'm afraid she's already gone for the day." She studied him for a moment, then added gently, "You look like you've seen a ghost." He almost laughed, but it came out hollow. "Maybe I have," he said quietly. He ordered a coffee just to have something to hold, something to anchor him, then sat by the same window where Emily had been moments ago. From there, he could still see faint imprints of the twins' little hands on the glass. He touched the marks with his fingertips and felt something inside him break open, something he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. Over the next few days, he found himself returning to the cafe again and again, always at different times, always hoping to catch another glimpse of her. Sometimes he saw her walking with the twins near the park, their laughter floating through the air like music. Other times he only saw her from afar, her head bent slightly as she carried groceries or talked to neighbors. Each time he wanted to approach her, his courage failed. He didn't know how to start, how to apologize for years of silence and blame. What words could possibly undo what he had said to her? Then one rainy afternoon, fate intervened. He had been walking toward the cafe when the sky opened up, and within seconds he was drenched. As he turned to head back, he heard a familiar voice call out, a small, clear voice. "Mommy, my shoe." He turned instinctively. Across the street, Emily was kneeling beside one of the twins, adjusting her little pink shoe while the other girl clutched a small umbrella. The rain fell in silver sheets around them, and for a moment, the sight of them together was so beautiful it hurt. Without thinking, he crossed the street. "Emily," he said, his voice almost lost in the rain. She froze. Slowly, she stood up, turning toward him. Her expression was unreadable, part shock, part fear, part something softer that she tried to hide. "Kevin," she whispered, barely audible. The twins looked up at him curiously, their big brown eyes wide. He didn't know what to say. Every word he'd rehearsed in his head vanished the moment he saw her up close. She looked different, older, stronger, but still achingly familiar. The rain plastered her hair against her cheeks, and he had the sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and brush it away, but he didn't. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. He swallowed hard. "I didn't plan this," he said. "I came here for work. I didn't know you were here." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "You never did know where I was, Kevin." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked down, guilt flooding through him. "I know," he said quietly. "But now I do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain kept falling, soaking through their clothes, and one of the girls tugged on Emily's hand. "Mommy, who's that?" she asked. Emily hesitated, her lips parting, but no words came. Kevin's heart twisted. He dropped to one knee so he was eye level with the girls. "Hi," he said softly, offering a small smile. "I'm a friend of your mom's." The girls exchanged curious glances, then smiled back shyly. It was such a simple moment, but to Kevin, it felt like the most profound one of his life. When he finally stood, Emily looked at him for a long time, her eyes full of questions and memories. "We should go," she said at last, her voice almost breaking. She turned to leave, the twins holding onto her hands, but before she walked away completely, she stopped and looked back at him. "You should stay away from us," she said quietly. "You've done enough." Then she walked off into the rain, the two little girls skipping beside her, leaving Kevin standing there in the downpour, his heart shattering all over again, but this time, for all the right reasons. Kevin didn't move for a long time after Emily walked away in the rain. The streetlights flickered against the puddles, and the world around him blurred into meaningless motion. Cars passed, people hurried under umbrellas, but he stood frozen, watching the spot where she had disappeared with the twins. Every part of him wanted to run after her, to tell her everything he hadn't said for years, but something deeper, something quieter, held him back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the sudden understanding that this time, rushing toward her would only drive her farther away. So he let her go, his heart pounding, rain soaking through his clothes until he couldn't tell where the storm outside ended and the one inside him began. That night, he returned to his rental house by the ocean, drenched, cold, and hollow. He stripped off his wet jacket and sat in the dark, the only sound the relentless crash of waves against the rocks. He poured himself a drink, then another, but the whiskey burned instead of numbing him. Her words echoed in his head, "You've done enough." He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but there was no one to hear. And even if she were there, he didn't know what he could possibly say. She was right. He had done enough damage. He had built walls of pride so high that even his own heart couldn't see past them, and now he was paying the price. But the image of the twins wouldn't leave him. Their laughter, their curious eyes, the way one of them had tugged at her mother's hand and looked up at him, it all played on repeat until he felt like he was losing his mind. Days passed, but the rain didn't stop. It was as if the entire town had been pulled into some slow, gray melancholy that mirrored his own. Kevin tried to focus on work, throwing himself into the hotel project with obsessive precision. The contractors were impressed, the investors pleased, but none of it mattered. His thoughts drifted constantly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, older, wiser, but still carrying that same quiet strength that used to drive him crazy. He thought about how she must have struggled, raising 2 children on her own, and the shame that came with that thought nearly crushed him. She had done what he was too cowardly to do. She had chosen love over fear, courage over comfort. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he went for a walk along the shore. The sea was restless, dark waves crashing against the sand, wind pulling at his hair. He stopped near the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, staring out at the horizon. He didn't hear footsteps behind him until a soft voice broke through the sound of the wind. "You shouldn't be out here alone." He turned, startled, and found Mrs. Turner, the cafe owner, standing a few feet away with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She gave him a knowing smile. "You've been coming around the cafe," she said. "And you've been looking at someone who doesn't want to be looked at." He didn't deny it. He just nodded, his throat tightening. "She has every right to hate me," he said quietly. Mrs. Turner studied him for a long moment, then said, "Maybe. But hate and hurt are not the same thing. Hurt can still forgive." Her words stuck with him long after she left. That night, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he wrote. It wasn't something he planned, it just happened. He sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper and started pouring out everything he had buried for years, the anger, the fear, the regret. He wrote about the day he pushed her away, about the emptiness that followed, about how he had spent years pretending success could fill the space she left behind. He wrote about the twins, how seeing them had undone him, how he had seen his reflection in their eyes and realized that they were the proof of everything he had thrown away. The words came in fragments, uneven and raw, but by the time he finished, the paper was damp with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. The next morning, he folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. He didn't know if he would ever give it to her, but writing it had done something to him, it had made the weight in his chest a little lighter. Over the following week, he tried to rebuild himself, not for her, but because he realized that the man she had left behind wasn't someone he respected either. He started helping around the hotel site personally, working alongside the crew instead of barking orders. He donated equipment to the local school and anonymously funded repairs for the daycare near the cafe. He didn't want credit or recognition, he just wanted to do something that wasn't about himself for once. Then, one morning, fate intervened again. He had gone to the bakery early to pick up coffee for the crew, and as he stepped outside, he nearly collided with a familiar figure. Emily stood in front of him, holding two small paper bags, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither spoke. She looked different in the morning light, softer, calmer, but there was still tension in the way she held herself. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally. He nodded, trying to steady his voice. "I didn't expect to see you either," he admitted. There was an awkward pause before she added quietly, "The girls talk about you. They think you're someone important because you drive the big black car." That made him laugh, a low, quiet sound that felt strange after so long. "I'm not that important," he said. "Not anymore." She hesitated, then sighed. "Kevin, I don't want this to get complicated. My daughters are happy. They don't need." She trailed off, and he could hear the unspoken words, "They don't need you." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to ruin anything. I just wanted to see them again. To see you." Her eyes softened for the first time. "Why?" she asked. "Why now?" He took a deep breath, his voice low. "Because I finally understand what I destroyed." The honesty in his tone startled her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the morning sunlight casting soft golden light on her hair. "You can't just come back and fix everything with words," she said finally. "You can't erase what happened." He nodded again. "I know," he said quietly. "But maybe I can start with something small. Maybe I can prove that I've changed." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face as if trying to find the man she used to know. Whatever she saw there made her expression falter just slightly. "The girls love the park by the fountain," she said at last. "We go there most afternoons." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either, it was a door left slightly open. Kevin didn't smile, but his eyes glistened with something close to hope. "Then I'll see you there," he said softly. When she walked away, he stayed rooted to the spot, the scent of fresh bread still clinging to the air. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a possibility. He knew this wouldn't be easy, he would have to earn every second of her trust back, but he was ready. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing success, or pride, or control. He was chasing redemption. And this time, he wouldn't stop until he found it. The next few weeks unfolded in a rhythm Kevin hadn't known he needed. Every afternoon, just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, he found himself walking to the park near the fountain. It started quietly, almost cautiously, like two people testing the depth of fragile water. Emily would sit on the bench near the big oak tree, her eyes following the twins as they played with the other children. Kevin kept his distance at first, sitting on another bench across the path. Sometimes the girls noticed him and waved, sometimes they were too caught up in their games to care. But Emily always noticed. She never said much, only a brief nod of acknowledgement when he arrived, and sometimes a faint, hesitant smile when he left. It wasn't much, but to Kevin, it was everything. He didn't try to push. Instead, he simply showed up. Some days he brought small things for the twins, books, a set of colored pencils, a box of chocolate muffins from the bakery. He never gave them directly to Emily, he would hand them to the girls when they ran past him, and they would always run back to her with bright eyes, holding up the gifts like treasures. Emily didn't stop them, but she also didn't thank him, at least not out loud. Yet one afternoon, when she gathered the girls to leave, she looked at him and said quietly, "They shouldn't expect this every time." He nodded, his voice low and sincere. "I know. I just like seeing them smile." It was the first real conversation they'd had since that day in the rain. Over time, their encounters grew longer, more natural. Sometimes she sat beside him on the bench while the twins played, though she kept a careful space between them. They spoke about ordinary things, the town, the cafe, the twins' love for painting, the school they would soon start. Kevin listened more than he spoke. It was strange for him, a man used to commanding every room he entered, to simply listen and not control the conversation. But with Emily, he found he wanted to hear everything, every small detail of her life that he had missed. When she talked about the nights she had stayed awake with 2 crying babies or the mornings she had gone to work on barely an hour of sleep, guilt tore through him like a blade. "You did it all alone," he said one day, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look at him when she answered. "I had no choice." Kevin started to change in ways even he didn't notice at first. His employees at the hotel project saw it before he did. He was still firm, still professional, but the edge was gone. He smiled more. He asked about their families. He stopped measuring time only in profits and deadlines. It was as if those quiet afternoons at the park were rewiring something inside him, softening the parts of him that had been hardened by years of pride and control. And Emily noticed it too, though she said nothing. She saw how he crouched down to talk to the twins instead of towering over them, how his voice softened when he asked about their drawings, how he seemed to carry the same exhaustion and hope that she herself had once carried. One day, as the twins played by the fountain, the younger of the two, Lily, slipped on the wet stone and started crying. Before Emily could reach her, Kevin was already there, kneeling beside the girl, checking her knee for scratches. Hey, it's okay," he said softly, his hands trembling slightly. "It's just a little bump." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handkerchief, dabbing at the scrape as Emily approached. For a brief moment, their hands brushed, and she froze. The touch sent a jolt through both of them, familiar, electric, and terrifying. When he looked up, their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, but his voice caught when he replied, "You don't have to thank me." After that, something subtle shifted. She stopped avoiding him as much. She began asking him questions, small, cautious ones at first. How long he planned to stay in town, what his next project would be, whether he still kept in touch with anyone from the city. He answered honestly, no longer hiding behind the armor of a polished executive. "I used to think building things was my purpose," he told her one afternoon, watching the twins chase pigeons through the grass. "Now I realize I've spent years building walls instead." She said nothing, but he saw her glance at him, the faintest trace of emotion flickering in her expression. One windy evening, the twins ran up to Kevin holding a drawing. "Look," they said, their faces glowing with pride. It was a picture of 4 stick figures, a man, a woman, and 2 little girls, holding hands under a big sun. "That's you," said Rose, pointing at the tall figure. Emily's breath caught. She opened her mouth to say something, to correct them, but the words wouldn't come. Kevin smiled, though his eyes glistened. "It's beautiful," he said softly. When the girls ran off again, Emily looked at him with something close to panic. "You can't encourage that," she said, her voice trembling. "They don't understand." Kevin met her gaze. "Then help me understand," he said quietly. "Because all I see is what I threw away." She turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. "You think you can just walk back in and fix everything with kind words and little gifts? That's not how it works, Kevin. I had to become someone else to survive what you did to me." He swallowed hard. "I don't want to fix everything," he said. "I just want to be part of what's real now. Even if it's small." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the laughter of the children nearby. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Then prove it," she said. And so he did. Over the next several weeks, Kevin kept showing up, not as a savior or a man trying to reclaim something, but as someone willing to learn. He helped around the daycare, donated supplies to the local community center, and even volunteered to fix a broken swing at the park. Every action was quiet, genuine, and without expectation. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. The twins began calling him Mr. Kevin, and Emily no longer corrected them. She even started to laugh again when he was around, soft, unguarded laughter that reminded him of the nights they used to spend talking until dawn. One afternoon, when the sky was turning pink and gold, Emily turned to him and said, "They'll ask one day. About you. About why you weren't there." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Kevin took a deep breath. "Then tell them the truth," he said. "Tell them I was a fool who didn't know what love was until it was too late." She looked at him for a long time, and for the first time since they had met again, her eyes softened completely. There was no anger left, no resentment, only quiet, fragile understanding. That night, Kevin couldn't sleep, but this time it wasn't because of guilt. It was because of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Real, painful, beautiful hope. He didn't know what would come next, or whether he would ever be fully forgiven, but he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving again. For the first time, he had found something worth staying for. The morning the world began to change for them came quietly, without warning. Kevin woke early, the faint light of dawn painting the ocean in soft hues of silver and gold. He had never been one for early mornings before, but now he found peace in them. The sound of waves had become his heartbeat, the stillness before the town awoke a kind of prayer. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, thinking about how much had shifted in only a few months. He no longer lived in a penthouse surrounded by silence but in a small rented house where laughter from the street drifted through the open windows. His phone rang less these days, but when it did, it no longer filled him with dread. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing time, he was living inside it. That afternoon, Emily invited him to join her and the twins for the town spring festival. It was the first time she had ever asked him to come anywhere with them, and when she did, her voice carried a quiet uncertainty, as though she was still testing the limits of how much she could trust him. "The girls keep asking if you'll be there," she said, not meeting his eyes. He had to fight to keep his voice steady when he answered, "I wouldn't miss it." When he arrived later that day, the square was alive with color and laughter. Stalls lined the streets, selling flowers, sweets, and handmade crafts, while music floated from a small stage near the fountain. The air smelled like caramel and ocean salt. Emily stood by the fountain, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, wearing a light blue dress that reminded him painfully of the first time he'd seen her years ago. The twins ran to him as soon as they spotted him, their small hands grabbing his. "You came," they shouted in unison, their excitement so pure it nearly brought him to his knees. The four of them spent the afternoon together, moving through the crowd like a family that had always been one. The girls pulled him toward every stall, demanding he taste this or try that, their laughter a constant melody around him. Emily watched them with a mixture of joy and something deeper, something that looked like fear that this might all be too good to last. Every so often, their eyes met, and in those brief glances, unspoken words passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a bridge to it. As the sun began to set, the square filled with golden light, and a band started to play soft music near the fountain. The twins danced clumsily in the open space, their small arms flailing as they spun in circles, laughing until they fell over. Emily smiled, her hand covering her mouth as she watched them. Kevin stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence but not close enough to scare her away. "They look like you when they smile," he said softly. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said after a moment. "They look like you." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the twins, Lily, ran up to the bandstand, tugged on the sleeve of a musician, and whispered something to him. The man laughed and nodded. A moment later, the music stopped, and the crowd quieted as Lily climbed onto the small stage, her little sister following right behind her. Emily froze, her face going pale. "Oh no," she whispered. "What are they doing?" Kevin smiled faintly. "I think we're about to find out." Lily took the microphone, her small voice echoing through the speakers. "We want to sing a song for our mommy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Because she's the bravest mommy in the world." The crowd erupted in applause, but Emily stood motionless, tears filling her eyes. When the girls began to sing, it wasn't perfect, some words were forgotten, the melody wavered, but it was beautiful. Their voices carried innocence and love in every note, and by the time they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the square. Emily covered her face, sobbing quietly, while Kevin stood beside her, his heart breaking and healing all at once. When the girls ran back, Emily knelt to hug them, whispering, "You're my whole world." Lily looked up at her with the same calm wisdom children sometimes carry and said softly, "Mr. Kevin helped us practice." Emily's eyes widened as she looked up at him. He hadn't wanted her to know. He had spent the past few evenings helping them memorize the words, sitting with them in the park after she went home. "You did this?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. He hesitated before answering, "They wanted to make you smile." Something in her broke then, not in a painful way, but in a way that released all the tension she had been carrying for years. She stood, wiping her tears, and before she could stop herself, she stepped forward and hugged him. It was tentative at first, her arms uncertain, but when he wrapped his around her, she didn't pull away. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, she let herself lean into him, feeling his warmth, his heartbeat, his quiet apology in the way he held her. "You really changed," she whispered against his chest. "I had to," he said softly. "Because losing you was the only thing that ever taught me what love really is." The weeks that followed were gentler, filled with small moments that stitched together the beginnings of a new life. Kevin didn't rush anything. He didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. Sometimes he joined them for dinner, sometimes he simply walked them home after the park. The twins had started calling him Dad without even realizing it, and though it startled Emily at first, she didn't correct them. It felt right, in a way that words couldn't explain. The day she finally invited him into their home, it felt like crossing an invisible line. It was a small house, cozy and full of life, drawings taped to the walls, the smell of cookies in the air. He stood there for a long time, taking it all in, and said quietly, "This is what home is supposed to feel like." One evening, as they sat together after the twins had gone to bed, Emily looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said softly. "But I didn't know how to let you back in. I didn't trust myself not to get hurt again." Kevin reached for her hand, his voice steady. "Then don't trust me yet. Just let me earn it." She smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around his. "You already are." Years later, people in that town would still talk about the day the CEO who once owned half the city chose to stay in their small coastal town. They said he built a school, opened a community center, and spent every weekend at the park with his daughters and his wife, the woman who had once walked away from him. But for Kevin, none of it was about what people said. It was about the sound of laughter in the mornings, the smell of pancakes on Sundays, and the way Emily would look at him sometimes, her eyes full of the love they had fought so hard to rebuild. He had once believed that success meant control, that power was the only way to protect himself from pain. But now, watching his daughters chase each other through the grass while Emily sat beside him with her hand in his, he understood the truth he had spent half his life running from. Love wasn't about control. It was about surrender. It was about showing up, again and again, even when you didn't deserve another chance. And this time, Kevin wasn't just a man trying to make amends. He was a man finally living the life he had once thrown away, and realizing it was worth every mistake it took to find his way back.